NATO was an organization that was established to defend against Russia, but it is precisely because of this that Russia is so threatened in the status quo and is necessitated to act out in aggressive ways. We aim to restore true peace on side proposition today, so proud to propose. I have two arguments to make from side proposition today. Firstly, on why we get less Russian aggression, and secondly, on why US reliance is bad. But before that, I have three pieces on framing. Firstly, what does gradually withdrawing from NATO look like? We would obviously do this in a fairly smart manner. Firstly, we think that we'd set up necessary alliances before leaving. But secondly, we think that the primary funding nations of NATO will likely be the last to leave NATO so that it remains functional in some sort of manner before eventually closing. The second piece of frame, we think that we still have the EU Mutual Defense Treaty under our side of the house. So how is this different from NATO, which opposition side needs to defend? We think that it is different in mainly three ways. Firstly, we think the structural purpose is basically different. We think that the NATO is basically a military agreement, and on the other hand, we think that the EU is a mainly purely economic agreement, right? Which means that there's less active military and it's only relevant for self-defense mechanisms. But secondly, we think that the degree of interaction or the degree of military intervention from NATO and EU is basically different. We think that the NATO has active military intervention, whereas EU is mainly incredibly passive. But thirdly, we think that the frequency of military operation is also different. We think that for NATO, there's a daily operation and daily training that happens on the ground, whereas for EU, there's basically none unless conflict is actively instigated. But third piece on framing then, we think that these countries that pull out of NATO will still be able to defend themselves in the long term, and this is the implication of all of this framing. A, because of the EU Mutual Defense Treaty, but B, because of the individual agreements that are formed between European countries. We think that countries like Germany still have a huge incentive to defend their borders against any aggression from Russia, which is why they would likely have tried to set up buffer zones in different countries and therefore militarize other countries and stuff like that. But lastly, we think that they also have the capacity to defend against other countries right now. We think that in the status quo, the reason why European nations are not spending enough money on the military is because there's a collective action problem, because they think that the US, through NATO, will defend them, because they know that the nature of NATO is very, very interventionist. We think that these funds that are not being used on their military in the status quo will be unlocked once they actually go outside of NATO and join the EU, in which they can actually now spend their money on their own military. No, thank you. I'll then go into my first argument on why we get less Russian aggression. The thesis of this argument is to say that NATO is incredibly threatening, which is why in the status quo continues, we think that Russia will be even more aggressive. We think that this is basically three reasons as to why NATO is so instigates so much aggression in Russia. A, because of the offensive nature of NATO. Obviously, as we told you in framing, they do things like active military training. It says it is a defense pact, but it really isn't when you see all of its past operations in Africa or all of its past operations in Yugoslavia. So why does this instigate a Russian conflict then? We think that Russia will believe that they will be attacked anyway because NATO is such an active military threat, which basically means that if they're going to attack them anyway, you might as well attack them first so that you can have an upper hand in the conflict and actually be the one negotiating all those where the conflict takes place and stuff like that. In the comparative, we think that the EU is a purely economic alliance. So even if countries do go into the EU Defense Pact, we think that Russia firstly will think that there's no reason to attack them to begin with, because they won't be attacked unless you attack them first. But secondly, the fact that these countries made an active transition and made an active decision to actually transition to a less aggressive treaty means that Russia will view these countries much more favorably and then instigate much less conflict. But B, we think that another reason why NATO is so threatening is because of ideological tensions that it has with Russia. NATO was literally instigated and established to be anti-Russia. And we think that Putin has demonized NATO to a large extent over the course of history. And from the eyes of Putin, NATO is imperialistic, it is expansionist, it is against everything that Russia stands for. We think that it is because of these reasons that if NATO does attack, or if NATO continues to exist, NATO. In the comparative, we think that the EU is much more of an economic alliance, as we told you. It is never anti-Russia. We think that Russia has never demonized like EU before, like historically speaking, which is why they're much less likely to be aggressive and stuff like that. We think the impact of this one is simple. We think that Russia will be much more willing to negotiate with the EU when the EU does something like a little bit aggressive, because they do not think it is an ideological loss to negotiate with them. We think that the third mechanism under this is that there's a perception of power imbalance. And that is to say, we think that the NATO is expanding literally by the minute, with Ukraine wanting to join NATO and Georgia trying to join NATO. So if Russia were to attack NATO, it is only now in which they would be able to gain a strategic advantage over NATO, because this is when NATO is the weakest. In the comparative, we think that the EU, the last country that joined the EU was literally in 2004, which was Croatia, and we don't think that the EU will expand a lot in the future, which is why Russia won't be as panicked as to aggressively attack EU as it will be to Russia. All of these proving that Russia will be much more aggressive towards NATO, and why we were able to prevent that on our side of the house. Our second argument is on why we think that the US reliance that these countries get through NATO is very, very bad. So firstly, we think that the US is very, very likely to leave NATO or defund NATO in the very near future. And this is because there's a growing anti-NATO narrative within the United States, because it literally serves the United States no geopolitical funds. It funds so much into NATO, but is literally getting nothing back in return. We think that, that is the reason why they're likely to leave. We think that in the comparative, the US won't immediately leave on our side of the house when countries start leaving the NATO. And this is because the US doesn't have to spend as much resources on NATO anymore when more countries are leaving, right? So the implication of this is that in the process of countries gradually leaving NATO, we don't think that the US will get up and leave and will be able to maintain some scope of geopolitical stability in the short term. Well then, why is the US ultimately leaving in the long term very, very bad? We think that this is bad because countries won't be able to defend themselves immediately. And it is impossible for these countries to be able to develop their own individual militaries in time for two reasons. A, because it is unpredictable when the US is likely to leave. We think that the policies of Trump are very, very volatile. And we think that the really tight electoral nature of the US means that you never know which political parties are going to be voted in, which is why it is impossible to preempt and actively develop your military in time. But B, it also just takes a lot of time to develop your own military. All of this to prove that when the countries remain in NATO, they face really short-term risks that occur of the US leaving. For all these reasons, so proud to stand on the side proposition today. Thank you.
Thank the first opposition speaker for their speech, and I'll open the debate for the opposition lead by the first opposition speaker.
Today, I'm just going to be going through a couple key pieces of rebuttal from their first speaker, and then going to our main point. Firstly, we're going to their first speaker when they talk about when they give us this narrative that NATO, the European countries should leave NATO because this just leads to Russian aggression, and that NATO's this league that Russia's demonizing NATO and are just scared of NATO, and that's why they're attacking them. But panel, this is just inherently wrong. We tell you, Russia didn't attack Ukraine because they were scared of NATO. Russia didn't attack Ukraine because they were scared of NATO. They just attacked Ukraine because they wanted the land in Ukraine. They didn't care. They weren't scared. They wanted the land, right? Because in the end, if Russia was so afraid of NATO, and if they were if they just attacked because they're scared, then they would just not attack in the first place, right? Because of the fact that NATO's there. If they attack Ukraine, for example, or if they attack NATO countries, they know that NATO is going to respond, right? So if they were so scared of NATO, they wouldn't attack them in the first place. I mean, that their whole case falls apart the fact that Russia just all they care about is getting more land, right? Putin attacked Ukraine because he wants more land, not because he is scared of NATO, right? Second, we also see that, second, they also tell us that the US won't leave NATO until the very end, right? That at the beginning, the US will probably still stay in NATO. But this is also just inherently wrong. So when we look at what the US actually wants from NATO, they don't care about the money. The US has so much money. They don't want money from NATO. What they care about is getting intelligence from NATO. What they care about is getting access to bases, right? And these are some of the things that are going to go away at the very beginning when NATO splits up, right? The money might still be there until a bit to the end, but that's what the US cares about. So the US is actually incentivized to leave quite early and not stay in because what they actually care about will be gone from quite the beginning. Now, going to some pieces of paper from our side and going to that basis matters. So firstly, first we tell you that first we tell you that this looks like a complete removal of all European countries from NATO. Right, this looks like there's stopping of sharing of intelligence between NATO countries. There's stopping of base sharing. Right, all countries, all the troops from different countries in different NATO bases, in different NATO countries will be pulled back to their original countries. Right? Those tell you this is going to be extremely expensive because, of course, logistically you're going to have to just move away a lot of different people from different bases. Right, all these people are going to have to get new jobs. They're going to have to train themselves in a new way because they're being moved. Right, so first logistically, also just the process of separating all the systems, deciding who gets what in the when you're splitting up, it's also just going to take a lot of effort and money. Right. Now going to our first argument about how this is actually better protection for all NATO countries, both from the outside and also inside, and minimizing conflicts inside NATO. Now we're just looking at how this actually protects NATO countries from non-NATO countries. Right? Firstly, when we look at when NATO's collective forces are, of course, a much stronger force than each individual country. Right? They present a much bigger force, and it stops. No, and it basically firstly already scares most enemies into stopping attacking them, right? A lot of people do not want to attack NATO in the first place because they know that if they attack the NATO country, all the other NATO countries are there. They have so many resources, they have so much intelligence that they will probably not stand a huge chance because of all the other countries are forced to actually intervene and help the country or defend the country that has been attacked, right? But secondly, you also see that if a country gets attacked, there's just a lot more intelligence, right? Other NATO countries, through their intelligence, they know they most probably can predict the attack much easier. They have so many more resources of figuring out how the attacks are going to be. The element of surprise is just way less, and they'll be able to deal with these attacks much easier, right? Because of all the intelligence from pooling all the different resources that NATO has, right? So yes, they'll be able to pool all these resources. Now, what is the impact of this? We see that, of course, the fact that if we can actually stop people from attacking, or if NATO can actually stop countries from attacking NATO countries in a second, can actually stop other countries from attacking NATO countries. This, of course, saves us. This, of course, stops wars from even happening in the first place because people won't even attack NATO countries, which, of course, saves lives. Typically, right?
They could have attacked Ukraine decades ago. The reason why it happened now is because Ukraine tried to join NATO. NATO is expanding, and that scares Russia. Obviously, it aggressive Russia.
But in the end, Putin still only attacked NATO. Putin still only attacked NATO because he wants that, right? Which we see we see that Putin attacked Putin still only attacked Ukraine. Putin still only attacked Ukraine because he actually wants that, right? He didn't attack them in the sense that he says, I just want to because he's so scared of Russia of NATO that he's so scared of NATO that he couldn't. He's so scared of NATO that he has to attack them now. No, he did it because he actually wants that, right? And to a certain extent, we tell you, yeah, if he is scared at some point when Ukraine is part of NATO, he's so scared that he won't, right? There's a reason why Putin actually attacked Ukraine and not other European countries that are inside NATO because they're already there, right? At that point, we tell you it's actually good that he's scared to a certain extent because it'll actually stop him, as I said before, it'll actually stop him from attacking those countries because he knows all of the NATO countries will have to come to the defense. So actually, that actually makes the whole point about the fact that Ukraine wasn't part of NATO, and if they were, he probably wouldn't have attacked, but he wanted the land, that's why he attacked. And he only was able to do that because they weren't part of NATO, which is going to be the fate of all other European countries if they split NATO up. Now, going to our second standpoint about how this actually loses tension within European countries, right? Firstly, when we see that most European countries are in NATO, we see that most of them therefore feel protected from each other. They know that they're allies with all of them, and they feel protected with each other. They have quite no incentive to attack each other because they also depend on resources that they get from each other. the kind of intelligence that they get from other countries and depend on the resources, right? So there's no sense in the attacking other countries. You'll see that any conflicts that arise within European countries can be much easier dealt with because they're all part of NATO. There's so many more diplomatic processes that are in NATO, people that are appointed inside NATO to actually help mitigate the conflicts that do actually happen within NATO countries, right? Therefore, it's going to lead to less military action, but there can be some diplomatic action. Like we see this, for example, now with what Macron did. He basically showed Trump the middle finger by recognizing Palestine as a country. This was still diplomatic action he was able to take. He just doesn't take military action, which is the thing we want to avoid because that's the thing that will cost lives. And how to tell you life is the most important thing. We should save as many lives as possible, right? So when countries in Europe are all part of NATO, they don't really have a reason to attack, right? And we can see if they were to split up, we can see, for example, maybe a landlocked country inside of Europe would not have any naval bases anymore, might also not have resources that other countries have, and now they actually have a reason to attack other European countries, right? Now they have a reason to go and try and get those resources because they don't have this, because they don't have that protection anymore. They actually have a reason to do this, they have an incentive to do this, and this will just cause even more conflicts, right? And why we don't want conflicts inside of Europe, right? All that conflicts leads to all that military conflicts, we don't want military conflicts. All that military conflicts lead to is a loss of lives and it costs an extreme amount of money, right? War is always expensive. And we of course want to save lives, we also want to make sure that we can save as much money and monetary as much money as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opposition speaker for their main speech, and now we continue the debate for team proposition made by the second proposition speaker.
The question we asked him first is fairly simple. Why is the US still in NATO, and why did they originally join NATO? Well, the original reason was fairly obvious. It was expansion of soft power in Europe. But our second argument argued that the incentive for the US to remain in NATO is decreasing day by day. The more and more, for example, the US creates treaties with the countries in Europe to get intel, which is their mechanism for US staying in NATO, and the more and more US becoming less reliant on Europe for their defense, we would argue that the US is likely to leave. And in such a context that we live in, the deterrence factor that opposition would argue not only decreases, then our second argument directly cuts their line of analysis in their first argument, but furthermore, that there's an instigating harm in the short term of extreme weakness in European nations at the point in which the US leaves before the countries are able to expand their militaries. Crucially, our second argument was then fairly simple. Rather than allowing for Trump to dictate when NATO falls, we should be the one to dictate it, because we can then structure our militaries around it. But before I get to that clash, I want to first deal with the best case charitable interpretation for their rule. This is a situation in which the US is still in NATO, and the US still funds NATO to some extent, which side then still better protects countries. Our claim from first was this, that the NATO and its structure and its founding and every way it operates directly aggresses Russia. Crucially, even if they're able to prove mechanisms like deterrence and intelligence, as long as we're able to symmetricize these to some extent, the active aggression we prove in this argument is the tipping point for action occurring. The op response here is simple. They argue that Russia doesn't attack because of fear, it is simply about land and expansion of their horizons. The problem is, as my POI pointed out, then this would have happened decades ago and would have happened to a more significant extent. The reason why Ukraine was attacked is because they attempted to join NATO. The reason why these countries are under attack right now, and the reason why countries around, for example, Ukraine, post-USSR nations, have to be scared is because they're leaning towards the West. Crucially, obviously, Russia isn't showing on land. The land in Ukraine is not that unique to Russia, considering how massive geographically Russia is. Obviously, it's not about to be land. But secondly, even if this response were to stand, it doesn't engage to our analysis. Because even if this were true, and that Ukraine was attacked because of land, our mechanisms prove that this type of attack is still likely, regardless of what uniquely happened in Ukraine. Go ahead.
Yes, first you said USSR nations here as turning towards the West. So are you saying we're not in a world where Ukraine does not have the liberty to have a connection with the West?
No. They can be left-leaning, but the way they can be Western. The way they should be Western is not to aggress Russia by attempting to join NATO. We would argue that NATO as a function is wrong. If you want to be West-leaning, you can do it other ways. Don't aggress Russia by doing it through NATO. Let's respond to their analysis. Their analysis proves two things. First, on deterrence, and second, on intelligence sharing, both of which argue that they protect countries better. Crucially, at the top, I would note that our line of analysis actually supersedes the vast majority of their analysis because all of their analysis are only about current NATO nations. Our analysis also subsequently proves possible NATO nations are likely to get attacked to preemptively prevent these countries from being able to join NATO as happened in Ukraine. So even if they're able to prove both deterrence and intelligence, non-NATO nations who are prospective NATO nations still face harm. Let's actually engage though. Against deterrence, two main levels of response. One, I would argue that deterrence is to some extent at the very least symmetric in both worlds. Because deterrence is not necessarily about because deterrence need not be extreme advantage against Russia, it just needs to be sufficient. And we would argue that EU mutual defense treaties and defense treaties that countries have with one another is to some extent symmetric. Crucially, as long as we prove symmetric, we can take this deterrence clash because then OP uniquely proves a tipping point for deterrence no longer being a factor because of things like aggression. In response to intelligence then, the argument largely argues about how you can preemptively know of attacks. Obviously, this can symmetrically be done in the EU, where countries can still share information with each other, and we would argue that other countries are still likely to, for example, create treaties around this because they have obviously the incentive to know of attacks. Furthermore, I would secondly argue that you oftentimes just don't know of these attacks. Like, nobody predicted the Ukraine attack. If they want to claim that intelligence knew of it, they're wrong. Third, yeah, sure, actually go.
That's not exactly my point because Ukraine is not part of NATO, therefore they weren't able to predict the attack, therefore we're still detrimental.
Yeah, but no other country knew about it either. Like, no European nation and no current NATO nation knew about it either. Okay, this is assuming their best case, or the US remains. Our second argument proved the US is likely to leave, and their response actually doesn't deal with this. Crucially, this argument then is subsequent to their analysis, not just because it's the more realistic situation, but also on the scale of harm. Final thing in my speech then, third argument. We would argue that at worst, this war thing is just, in general, the unlikely impact in this debate. We don't think this is a very likely on net in either bench. We would argue that the NATO as a structure that forces nations to spend vast amounts of their GDP on the military itself is a negative harm, and an important one. Third argument, on forced GDP spending being bad. Firstly, what is the problem right now? The problem right now is that NATO in its constitution fundamentally demands all nations to spend what was originally a few percent, which is now 5% due to Trump tariffs, of their GDP on the military. Crucially, the reason why this is really bad is because it takes a lot of money away from other things that are more important to these countries. The important analysis here is this. A lot of countries don't need 5% GDP spending for their military to function in the way of deterrence and action. Japan doesn't spend 5%, and neither do a majority of these European nations who currently are in NATO. For example, when you look at, for example, Italy or Greece or Portugal or Spain, who are just so geographically distant from Russia that invasions against them are highly unlikely, 5% GDP spending, which is a massive portion of their income, billions of dollars, is not important. The impact is fairly simple. These tax dollars can be used not just to reduce tax rates to allow for more economic circulation to occur, but also, for example, reinvestment into more important things for these countries, like education in Italy, or welfare in Greece, or the manufacturing sector in Portugal, to allow for economic development to happen and for the quality of life in these countries to improve. This argument alone should win us 5% is being spent, and 5% will be spent, and this alone is a harm year on year. Even if you would argue that war is a speculative harm in this debate, this is the certain harm in this debate, and one that you should care about. Crucially, then, what all of this analysis proves, not only do we win on the likelihood of war occurring, but also we would argue that we largely semanticize all of their mechanisms, and we prove a certain harm in this debate. Final thing in my speech then. At worst, even if we don't prove this certain harm, we would argue that all of the talk about deterrence and intelligence are just symmetric in this debate. We already proved that to you. For these reasons, propose.
We thank the second proposition speaker for their great speech, and now we come here to the debate from opposition lead by the second proposition speaker.
Firstly, I'm going to broadly respond to their argument on Russian incentives and why they truly attack Ukraine. I'm going to make it crystal clear where their argumentation is deeply flawed. Firstly, on their response on why Ukraine was not attacked decades ago, and it was attacked recently because of American pressure. Many decades ago, the USSR was still established. If you look at the number of countries, because the USSR, let's say, ended in close to the late 20th century, there have not been many years where Russia has time to independently, build an infrastructure and have capability to start a full assault. But then even if we say that, okay, they could have done it before, the critical argumentation is that just because people were doing the right thing for the first 20 years does not mean that suddenly we can expect them to be, we cannot expect complete moral infallibility later on. But we see that how in 2014, due to the annexation of Crimea and due to the fact that of the limited, let's say, American or NATO response to the Russian aggression, we see why Ukraine were completely justified in seeking attachment to NATO because they recognize the defense mechanisms they have, right? And this is to say that if Russia were to attack, for example, Poland and other things, the annexation of or if Ukraine was already part of NATO in 2014, the annexation would have led to direct military confrontation by the US and would have led to Russia not being able to have a full frontal scale assault to this extent in Ukraine. But even if we buy that short, being charged, even if we say that Russia only attacked Ukraine because they were afraid of America, and even if we say they were not significantly deterred by currently, if we look at the hundreds of thousands of Russians killed by American supplied drones, even if they were deterred by that, we see that now it's very, very unlikely that any future conflicts will happen in the coming years because Russia is so drained by the current conflict in Ukraine that they're unable to start another conflict with, for example, Poland and other NATO countries because they don't have the capacity and they don't have the incentive considering how badly this military venture failed, right? Because they recognize, oh, we attack a NATO adjacent country, a country wanting to join NATO, and we got so screwed over that such a relatively small country who's not a nuclear power gets so much funding from NATO that that thousands of people are dying. We get sanctioned so much that countries are not buying our goods, our gas is not flowing to other countries, we have lost so much to a geopolitical dominance. You know what? NATO is still saying, let's attack Poland. This is completely not by. So very, very best case, this is equal. But then secondly, we see that because we see such a significant response on a non-NATO country, we argue the response would be significantly more if they attacked a NATO member because of these treaties, because they have written legislatively that the support is expected, which means that, for example, another annexation, let's say they want to attack the Czech Republic, these things would have a much stronger response and would deter Russian aggression, which is why NATO as a force itself is a force of deterrence, and we see how that does happen. The same reason why Russia attacked Ukraine and not other NATO countries, right? Sure, part of it is geographical, but the reason they attacked Ukraine at this time is taking also a bit of urgency, because they recognize, oh, if Ukraine is going to join NATO, it means it's going to be harder for us to annex the whole of Ukraine, because they're going to have more significant resources. This is why they attacked now. But secondly, in terms of, resources and looking at things. Because they argue that NATO is uniquely military, because they are such a strong military permanent force, we do argue that it is a significant deterrent, which means that the European economic incentive, the European groups, is not a significant deterrent. Also the individual treaties, that's the Germany, Italy, and Germany and Czech Republic, because they're not a collective of information, because they don't have shared satellites, because they don't have interfaces. As a collective, on an individual basis, when you sum that up, it's not going to have the power of the collective to work together. Because the collective, it's a representation not of the sum of the individual forces, but because of the sharing of resources, because of, let's say, ideal purchase conditions for weapons, they're going to be a more significant force to reckon with. But then note that because, and when we call this out, most of the analysis set up on setting up basically NATO, but just within Europe. They're like, oh well, they can set up new agreements, they can set up new military agreements. So any benefits we get from that are just going to be marginalized on their side because they're not going to have the framework of NATO. They don't have the experience. They need to set up all these new systems. They need to first set up new legislation. They need to hire more people. And with the absence of, let's say, the US, and now on why the US incentive is so crusade. Firstly, because the US incentive is so crusade. Firstly, because it's very unlike the Trump election, right? Trump is a lot of all mark no fight. He said he would attack Greenland. He said he would make Canada give us state. He said he would make Mexico pay for the war, right? He's a very talkative guy. He likes to appeal to his right-wing populist voters. Currently, he has no incentive to convince NATO to do this because of the intelligence uses, because they want this soft control in Europe, because the US wants to be able to have that influence in Europe, because they want to be able to access the bases, they want to access intelligence in Europe, they want to access these satellites, because of this quite simple geographical location, the US will continue to have incentive, and after the worst case, in 2 years we're going to get a new president anyways, right? You cannot have a whole speculative case on that the US maybe might leave NATO because they're not getting paid. You see how the US has always been the more prominent military spender, but the US has always stayed in quite simply because of the intelligence and geographical side. But secondly, in terms of Europe unprepared, you see how Europe has recently increased military spending because of fears. You see how Europe has increased, how even Brian talks about how the military spending is happening, which means they're going to be relatively more prepared. But then in the case that the US does leave, then as a collective, the European collective without the US, then in NATO, will still be better than their comparative argument of setting a completely new European-ish NATO that is completely speculative. When we say how this will look like, what is this? It will still be better because the frameworks exist, the agreements exist. So basically, NATO without US is still going to be better than fake NATO just for Europe without the added military pressure and incentives. So their whole benefits is completely marginalized. But then thirdly, on their case about the opportunity cost, I'm trying to argue, because as the motion suggests, the setup and establishing of independent military presence, that means you just set the establishment quite simply means increased spending because they don't have the access to, let's say, the NATO security net, because they don't have access to the infrastructure, right? So it's initially we say argue that this is actually going to be a win on our side, because firstly it's expensive, because firstly the transition, right? Because you have to hire new people, because you don't have access to the shared infrastructure to say things. Secondly, because it's the upkeep, right? Because firstly now since intelligence is not shared, that means you need, let's say, more spies, more hackers, and now this is, let's say, more R&D for like ships, more R&D for missiles, because let's say, because it's not in NATO, you have to spend more, because you don't have like that trade agreement with the military, right? Because now people don't want to send new weapons, because now you're not, structurally allied, right? And also because now people are more afraid of the war because they're individual entities, they want to spend more money truly, because they don't have this huge, colossal military force coming in to swoop them in case of Russian invasion. This is why there's going to be increased military spending on our side. So why is this bad for some of all the arguments, right? But also completely all the arguments. That means they cannot spend on education, they cannot spend on this. And specifically, we don't argue that the European structures are strained because we see how populist parties like the AfD are able to exploit people's borders, people's in access to education and this. But also a principal argument why this is bad, because to have this board things, because they're going to increase the local narrative and try to get more conscripts. That looks like propaganda, say, come support our country, military is good, we want more things. That means that people signing up to work for right because they're being told by propaganda that military is noble tradition. It means them working for these, let's say, unethical positions. And this is, we believe, is principally wrong to support a narrative to push weapons. But also specifically, generally, we see this can lead to the rise of nationalism within the country, because the methods in which these countries are going to propagate the military things is going to be through language to support your country. We are the Swiss people, join our military, we want to be strong in case of Russian assault. So in our side, the House panel note, we have increased spending, like they said, on the wrong things, more nationalism, and more threats to European countries. Thank you, never been prouder to oppose.
At the top, I'll just knock their second argument out and talk about three things. First, on Russian aggression. Second, on flexibility, and lastly, English reliance. First things first, let's chat about their second argument. Their argument that came from Elwell was to say that in instances where we have NATO, where we uniquely achieve the collectivization and nationalism that exists within Europe, in a counterfactual world of our world, somehow European countries will start fighting against each other. Firstly, I think it is worth pointing out the symmetric incentive that exists on both sides of the house if you want to have unity to begin with. Because all of their analysis was contingent on NATO being the only unifying force. One, EU exists. Two, your symmetric incentive to have peace on both sides of the house. One, because I think war is oftentimes resource intensive. You obviously don't want to send soldiers on the ground. Two, because I think it is politically costly to initiate the conflict to begin with. There are people like opposition parties holding you accountable. You need 2/3 majority from the Congress in order to initiate the conflict in most countries, which is why their argument is out. First question on Russian aggression. Opposition says that NATO creates deterrence. Proposition says that it escalates Russia. How do we break the deadlock? One, we flip their deterrence mechanism against their will because they mischaracterize the status quo that opposition needs to defend in their side of the house. Because our third argument was about that NATO keeps expanding in status quo on their side of the house. Because if you look at the real world, look at Sweden, which has joined NATO in 2023. Look at Ukraine, which is trying to join NATO, and many other countries who are currently fearing of the Russian aggression that exists in their world. And thank you. And they say Russia fears NATO. If that was the case, then that is analysis as to why Russia fears NATO in the future, and presumably their incentive analysis that they have posed to you about how Russia wants land, about how Russia has an ideological incentive to want to invade, which is true, might be true, will likely act against their side of the house, which is the reason why they likely attack if the deterrence exists. But the second thing I want to point out on the level of deadlock breaker is the existence of alternatives. Because I want to do an incentives debate. I would argue that Russia cares about its own dignity and its own defense. So absent NATO, they have an incentive to negotiate with the EU from our side of the house. Why is this likely? The reason for that is that war is costly and Russia themselves are currently getting harmed by this economic sanction that is stemming from the Russian-Ukraine war that is happening on the ground. Many of the economists say that Russian economy is oftentimes going to degrade in the future and yada yada yada. Why is it that on their side of the house, the incentive to attack overwhelmingly outweighs the incentive not to do so that exists in their world? The reason for that is Putin in status quo is a strong man leader where his legitimacy is built upon the image of a stronger Russia that exists in their world. But here's when the lack of analysis and response that came from their second speaker is particularly harmful for their case. Because what we outlined to the first speaker is that currently Putin has literally demonized the NATO that exists in their side of the house, which is the reason why when you have EU, when you have the lack of NATO, when countries gradually opt out of NATO, and when it is no longer a thing, that's when Putin can resort to more peaceful things that are more easier, and that is something that is much less costly on our side of the house. Why do you think that the incentive to invade, if it exists, was not an inherent one? It is something that Putin needs to resort to in instances where NATO is actively threatening to Russia, which is a nuanced case that effectively breaks the deadlock. Opposition says, if you cannot win, you wouldn't attack. One, this is predicated upon the assumption that you can perfectly calculate whether or not you can win, right? But obviously, from the lens of many of the even war experts, you just cannot win. You just cannot calculate which side will win. Like initially, Russia would, it was said that Russia would surrender in 1 year, but now there's 3 years and the war is dragging on, which is the reason why it's just much more speculative. But secondly, I want to note the irrationality of Putin to begin with. The reason why Putin is an irrational actor is because there's oftentimes, this is a dictator that is surrounded by yes men, which is why oftentimes their decision-making calculus is favored towards Putin that exists in their world. Before I move on to the second last one,
Can you prove either that the Ukraine war will end on your comparative, or that Russia has the remaining capacity to aggress other nations, owing to the fact they have spent so much on the Ukraine war?
Look how look how vertical their claim is, right? We don't have to prove that the Ukraine war will end. what we need to prove is that the conflict will get actively worse in their world, and even without the capacity, I just proved to you the irrationality and the incentive to Russia to initiate the conflict in instances threats exist. Second question on flexibility. Our claim is simple. When many of the countries have other priorities, this NATO forces even the smallest countries to spend your money on your military. The first response we provide to you is that establishing on your own military in the counterfactual is expensive. One, this is symmetric because NATO already requires countries to invest 5% of their money in military. On intuition, Japan even only spends 3% of military of their money into your military, which just illustrates the problem. But secondly, I would also note that most countries just don't need that much amount of military spending to begin with. Look at Spain, look at Italy, look at many other countries that are relatively impoverished within Europe, but are geographically far away from Russia. We are talking about these countries and the ways in which they can spend money in other places that they actually need. Third of all, if you wanted to talk about the smaller countries that are geographically closer to Russia, I would argue that countries that are rich, like Germany, still have an incentive to, engage in a passive treaty that as defense neutral treaty. And the reason for that is that they want these countries to stay on your side and not fall on the side of Russia because they want a cushion between those two countries. The reason why this is not a tension is because this is a much more passive thing. I.e., we've pointed out in your framing that I think this is not much more passive, and you don't engage in things like defense, like neutral defense act, like all the time. You don't have things like, like military operation that is happening in our side of the house. That is the difference. On weighing, three things. One, uncertainty. Our second speaker already talked about how this is the most certain thing happening in the debate. Even their side of the house have argued that the war is speculative. But secondly, it is the largest harm for many of these nations that just won't get attacked on either side of the house. It is a big deal for you to be able to invest 1% of your GDP into your education, into your jobs, into the manufacturing sector that you actually need to. But third of all, in terms of delta, I think this creates the largest delta in the debate. Last thing, I want to talk about the US alliance because they say the US will stay. But if you look at their analysis, it just doesn't make sense. The first thing that their response just only applies to Trump. One, I would argue that this wasn't just about Trump. It was an increased sentiments that currently exist within the US population to want to prioritize yourself because they are tired of being the global leader in status quo where there's a re-energization of people who thought that they are being ignored. Secondly, they say that the Trump has a symmetric incentive to gain soft power. One, because I think soft power is at best metric. You have EU-US economic trade on both sides of the house, and the fact that the US is a global actor that still has a lot of power just proves to you. In terms of the intelligence though, one, individual agreements still are enough. Two, I think Europe is an incentive to just, propagate your intellectualism, propagate your intelligence and share it with the US on both sides of the house. In terms of the basis though, I think the basis is not contingent on NATO existence to begin with, which means that this is largely symmetric on both sides of the house. Finally, they say that Europe is increasing its funding per Trump demands. I don't think this is a good thing. What we claim so the first thing I want to point out is that this is a good thing in instances where they need, but I don't think this is a good thing for universally the European countries to have money. All of our second argument still stands. For all those reasons, proposition takes us today.
Thank you, the proposition speaker for their kind speech, and now we have the debate for the opposition to the opposition speaker.
not give up this kind of benefit for Putin's interest. The problem with the proposition is of reasons. They have false assumption and capacity of the countries, and I will elaborate later. Secondly, they do not provide any incentive why Russia will attack NATO inherently. And thirdly, NATO does not create it only because of Russia's threat. NATO created because they symbolize military collaboration, or there's actually military collaboration. There's sharing of strategy, and there's sense of belonging and protection provided to the vulnerable geographic or economic stakeholders. Ukraine wants to join NATO because of Russia's attack. That's their goal. But the thing is, why they want to join NATO is because they're trying to escape the power of Russia. NATO is the only one they're seeking for, because there's where they find security and stability. I will move on to the clashes in debate. I will talk about where we have a stable and secure national front, and I will talk about feasibility overall. So firstly, where we have a stable and secure national front. Our proposition told us that they will have national security provided. For example, they mentioned Japan, they want to have a very secure nation, and also they will still have military collaboration. For example, through their framing, they mentioned, okay, because there's a gradual removal, they will have necessary alliance and EU neutral defense. But we tell that only NATO have the capacity to achieve the military requirement needs. We tell you that because they have a sophisticated system already, because they have all this kind of created military force, negotiation, and intelligence people who actually analyze what's happening in the military front, and they have so many troops, they have people, they actually have the force to achieve the capacity. And also, in the NATO, the countries there, they have internal accountability. That is why we have more. People are taking accountable with each other. That is meaning that if there's a war happening, all the people who are trying to help each other out, all the vulnerable will be taken account. They won't be attacked as like an independent country. Yes, sure. Maybe some of the strong economic sense or military sense of the country in the EU, they just go out from the NATO. They might have the abilities to sustain themselves. But there's still some of the small countries. They just simply don't have the capacity. For example, they don't have enough population of the troops. They don't have enough money. They have their own economic problem. They have too many deficits they need to meet. They just don't have money to allocate to the military. If you say, okay, some country, they don't need so much money like Spain. The thing is, they actually need money to, why? Because they need like the quality of the military force, or else they would just expose their vulnerability towards the wider ground. Before moving up to the deterrent, I will take a few lines.
You say NATO is so much better than the EU. What's the difference between NATO and the EU Mutual Defense Treaty? Is it US?
I will talk about what's the difference between EU and US, addressing my third point, which is intelligence on the military sharing. I will address your point later. But before that, I will talk about the deterrence point. The deterrence point, the only response we hear from them is that this is symmetrical. But they didn't provide with any clear mechanism of this. And our side of how the deterrence is possible, it's so feasible, because we tell you that people in collaborative effort, we have this kind of internal agreement. That is to say that when you have already like collaboration between each other among the group, you won't just have start a war, because you are in like a mutual accountability. So that means that our extent is bigger, and also because our extent is bigger, and that's the thing. And also without, for example, in NATO against all kinds of war, like Russia as the only kind of country they mention as a big power. For example, there's also big power as US, there's China, like this kind of country. They won't just attack NATO because there's so many countries within NATO. They have military forces. So, in terms of extent, we're still winning. Okay, moving on to intelligence over military sharing. Their point is EU also have it. What they tell us in the framing is that EU is only about economic focus mainly, and it's incapacitated. That means that, actually a contradiction to themselves, is that they have less capacity because they don't even address like a very direct military forces. Okay, even though there's some kind of military association with it, but it's not direct, it's not as big as NATO. NATO is so much bigger, and with the extent we create simply a bigger stability. And moving on. have to maybe, like, if your country don't even have like a military basis system, you have to hire this tons of troops and people, and maybe like it will deter to their normal life, and then maybe like a family, they're living on their own business, they have to be forced to go to military because their country need more military force. So their whole life will be like destroyed eventually. That's like the very big impact. But before that, I'll move on to like very minor things. What's more in reality? Okay, we know there's gonna be a lot of expenses. And the only responsibility here is that, okay, most countries, they don't need to spend a lot of money. But this is just a false assumption. Because actually, a lot of countries, they need it. They just blindly need it because, for example, they can be like, for example, and also they tell us, okay, why they don't use so much money, because geographically, they are far from Russia. But the thing is, it's not, this response is not very complete. Because firstly, that does not mean they have no threat. They can also be threatened geographically. For example, okay, because they're individually, then German probably will attack like Spain because they have some kind of beef between each other. And also Russia might attack by some drones, or they will have some secret initiation because they're like independent. So they will still have so many threats anywhere else. Before I move into our business,
So if you concede that deterrence is effective and couldn't pierce NATO expanding on your side becomes the reason why Putin wants to attack now.
So I didn't hear. Can you please don't come?
Yeah, so NATO expanding on your side of the house, if you say deterrence is effective and Putin fears NATO, that becomes the reason why Putin wants to attack countries right now.
Why does Putin want to attack NATO? Like, the thing is, okay, the reason why NATO created is because they want like stable and military forces. And okay, the reason why NATO might expand is because they want to protect country. They don't want to just create like a beef between each other. Maybe Putin have some problem, but if NATO provide like a stable ground, then the country will be protected. And because they say like, we think like some political negotiation is so much like less impact that we actually save life and then we provide a stable trope things. And also individual countries, they need to spend a lot more money due to like independency, due to exposed to the weaknesses geographically and politically. And also, I want to point out that because they like addressing our impact on propaganda and nationalism, and we think, and for all the reasons,
Thank the third opposition speaker for their great speech, and now taking the summary part of the debate, we will start to call for the opposition to class. Okay.
Honestly, I really like this debate, particularly because of how much we agree. Firstly, we agree that Putin was an irrational actor, but when we presented it as justification for them launching the assault on a different country, that was shunned away, saying no, Putin was only instigated by NATO, which then later they brought up, no, he's irrational to attack other countries regardless of their funding. Slightly contradictory, but we do want to emphasize that Putin does not have the time, they do not have the capacity, they are underfunded, they're focused heavily on the Ukraine war because Ukraine is being so heavily funded by NATO, which is why we think that any argument on their case, which they argue that, okay, Putin's going to start spontaneously starting other wars, like the other wars which he had perhaps more capacity to do so for the past few years when he had more money because less was spending in Ukraine. Ours going to spontaneously happen. We also do not buy any of that because, quite simply, because he cannot afford it, because too much time is spent on the country that is being supported by the behemoth force that is NATO. But secondly, in terms of NATO military and its benefit, what they initially framed is that NATO is unique quite simply because of its military presence and because it's military unlike the EU defense agreement, which means that it has this unique military benefits as a deterrent that we both agree that the European Council does not act, to the point where they go later to say, oh, they can set up new agreements, but they don't specify why this would be superior to the only established NATO, which is why we shouldn't buy any of that. But it's specifically because NATO has these military capabilities, because these are such a powerful force, because NATO is US plus Europe plus all these other countries, it is quite as adopting second things. It is very easy for Russia to calculate that yes, they will use this war because this is such a huge force. But then, moving on to why this actually does lead to deterrence, right? In terms of analyzing now for a change Ukrainian incentives, the reason Ukraine wanted to join NATO, as brought up by a third speaker, was that because NATO is this protection force, because this is a gateway to avoid said Russian aggression. As we analyzed multiple times throughout our speech, that NATO is a more powerful force because Russia did suffer due to NATO aggression, because Russia is struggling because of NATO interference. They quite frankly don't have additional incentive or capacity to do so, whilst they have failed to truly recognize why this would happen. And much of their argument is speculative, saying, oh yes, Putin is rational, whilst they can be national nations. But secondly, on the case they actually brought was on American leaving NATO. They say that, okay, you know what, America might leave NATO, and this is bad. But they did not say why the framework of why just the Europeans in NATO is going to be comparatively worse than the European agreement. It already gave you reasons why the NATO framework, because it is unity military, even with just the Europeans, is going to be superior to the European things that they develop. Which means that the benefits on our side of the house, if you have Europe only NATO, being completely charitable, I'm not going to go through why America might still stay, but why in Europe, this framework that has already been established completely outclasses their argument of they might set up a new system which might seem to be military, which on that side, which just basically makes a new NATO, so might as well do one where there's an off chance the US just stays, then we have to have a benefit. But then thirdly, on the case that does have, this opportunity cost. Now I want to do something, I want to highlight that we gave you tangible reasons why the countries will need to spend more. First, initially, because they need to separate the systems, they remove all the basis of the initial logistics states, very clear, completely uncontested. But then secondly, because the NATO is a more powerful military force than the individual ones, they can adopt them in their future. They can use their satellites, they can use their naval base, they can set up things. We give you tangible regions where they need to spend more, rather than some countries don't need to spend more, they're not specified. As thirsty countries do want to spend militaries, anyways, they have incentive to do so, but we give you tangible reasons. So in terms of mechanization only, thus we win. But now interestingly, I'm going to weigh against my own case. Even if it be completely charitable, our case on deterrence, because war is such a severe impact, because war literally leads to the death of millions. Because it was Ukraine that was attacked, and not Sweden, not the countries that are established in NATO. Weighing my case against my case, I want to argue that if we are weighed exclusively on deterrence of war, we should still go for us, because this is a very significant impact. Without war, we quite simply have more economic benefits, but more people dying, not less geopolitical tensions, etc. On this side of the house, what we get is maybe less war because Putin is irrational. Thank you.
Thank you, opposition reply speaker, and I'm concluding the debate with my
At the top, I'm going to spend 15 seconds just getting rid of the weird principle claim. Obviously, not only is military conscription just happening all the time, which is a continuation of the status quo, it is all practically contingent on deterrence and aggression, so I'll just prove that later, and that's still going to get rid of the principle. Okay, 3 things. First, US will leave. Will the US leave on opposition? Our claim was there's a growing anti-NATO sentiment. Maybe Trump amplifies this, maybe he doesn't, but all of this still means the US will leave. They have 3 reasons to claim the US won't. First is on soft power. Natsuki's response is to argue that soft power already exists. NATO was founded to prevent Russia from sucking up post-USSR nations. This can't happen anymore because these countries are westernized, liberalized, and they have too many economic ties. Their second claim was intelligence sharing. Naki claimed this is symmetric. You can still do agreements, and the incentive to share these intelligence is symmetric. Then, in response to bases, Natsuki argues, not only is this not a current provision in NATO anyway, and if countries are doing this voluntarily right now, they would just do it later afterwards anyway. There would never engages to any of this. Crucially, this means countries will leave the US in opposition. What was the implication of all of this? Sorry, countries would leave NATO in opposition. What was the implication of all of this? 1, it undercuts all of their claims on deterrence. Because NATO is heavily reliant on the US, 20-something% of their funding comes from the US. all of the deterrence factors that they would claim are significantly hampered when the US leaves. But also our second argument, it proves a massive short-term weakness of NATO the moment the US leaves. The way Op tried to deal with this is to argue that the US would play out symmetrically in our world once nations starts gradually leaving. Firstly, at worst, this response still doesn't disprove the first implication, unscrewing all of their deterrence mechanisms. But also secondly, the US won't leave because obviously now in our world we appease to their desires of wanting the European countries to be more militarily dependent. All of this proves that US will leave clash. Secondly, on deterrence versus aggression, there were two ways we broke the deadlock in favor of aggression. One, if they say deterrence is effective and Putin fears NATO, then NATO expanding on opposition becomes a reason why Russia wants to attack now, i.e. increased expansion into Ukraine. But also secondly, because alternatives to war is uniquely available when NATO doesn't exist, Putin has demonized NATO and has to attack. Much like the Swiss, which is I find very ironic, we would argue that aggression is going to be harmful and deterrence is better. Exactly what the Swiss do. Third final clash then, on these searching crimes. Our claim is fairly simple. 5% of GDP is big. The op response to argue against this is that the transition is extremely costly. There are two problems with this response. One, the transition fee doesn't apply for countries who don't need to increase their military spending. Obviously, this doesn't engage to our argument because this argument is only about nations who don't need the current amount of military and can decrease it. Clearly, Germany is never going to invade Spain. The second response is to argue that it doesn't cost the transition money either, because from our first speaker and all the way onwards, we talked about the fairly easy alternative to the EU that exists to the vast majority of big countries, and for military treaties to symmetrically exist. We would argue this argument is quite important. Spain being able to invest 1% of their GDP into social welfare to help with their aging population, or Greece being able to use more of their capital to subsidize the manufacturing sector so they can get out of the debt crisis. Resource is zero-sum. Much of these countries, 5% is too high. Finally, the conclusion of my speech is this. Even if we lose on anything, at worst, right? War is just not the likely and most important impact in this debate. That means that we win on the certain harms. But far more reasonably, even if we have to debate on the level of war, not only did we prove that aggression is the likely way that Russia invades rather than, active aggression likely is more harmful, and we disproved deterrence, but also secondly, that we proved that the US is likely to leave, which not only undercuts all of the mechanisms and implications that they have, but also then strengthens our second argument, proving to you that there's a massive shortfall in weakness in NATO the moment the US leaves, which leaves NATO vulnerable. For these reasons, I will stand.